But first of all, you're very welcome from the picket line to the Dáil. That's how democracy should be. And we're delighted to have your issues aired here today. And hopefully the debates will help you understand how the system works and better equip you to be able to argue against what you're hearing here. There is an idea in ecology known as the keystone species, and that is a species which occupies a niche in the whole ecological system. And when that species is damaged or removed, it has profound effects on the entire environment and ecology. And we know that here today in the Chamber, watching this debate, are the keystone species of the health service. If we fail to treat the scientific laboratory workers properly, fail to give them justice, fair play and equality, then running our health system will start to implode from the centre. Any group of workers that are removed or impeded in operating the system has a profound effect on all of us right across the board. Like the failure to retain psychiatric nurses in Indara is having a profound effect on the most vulnerable in our society. Behind the scenes, these unsung heroes that we've all acknowledged are absolutely essential. I first became aware of the MLSA and the work they did several years ago during the cervical check scandal, and I was hugely impressed with the evidence they gave before the Dáil hearings into what happened in that crisis. And it's worth remembering, because it tells us a great deal about the role of such workers, how political decisions based on ideology have a profound and negative effect on people's lives. In 2008, the MLSA and their members warned this state of the dangers of outsourcing the cervical check programme on the basis of competitive lower costs. And the result of that political decision is heartbreaking and obvious to all of us and affected many women. What's less clear is that the result of that decision to contract out the testing capacity to the US also meant that we lost university courses, we lost qualified graduates, and we lost hundreds of skilled staff that had intended and hoped to work in our public service. The warnings of the MLSA and other workers at the front line of laboratory testing were ignored because of a political decision and philosophy, and in many ways the last 21 years of this dispute is similar, ignoring the warnings of frontline workers on what is actually happening at the heart of our health service. We hear great investments coming into the Children's Hospital, the National Maternity Hospital indeed, and the new testing facility at the Coombe. Figures are in their billions, and they're mentioned as proof of the seriousness with which you, Minister, and the State take in providing services. But who will work in these buildings? Who will ensure that these shiny new buildings operate and that people get the services they need? It'll be workers, it'll be nurses, it'll be the laboratory testing staff such as the MLSA, and without them we simply have very expensive shells. And if we can't retain and recruit workers and keep them in a public system whose chief goal is not profit but public service, then it doesn't really matter that we spend billions on actual buildings if we don't have workers to do the job. The usual suspects tell us we can't treat one group of workers different to the others in the health service. And no doubt we'll hear commentators warn about the need to be prudent with state money. I've heard the same about nurses during their disputes some years ago. And what we need to remember is that when one group of workers, such as nurses or MLSA staff, are disrespected and treated badly, it is not a victory for prudent management of the state coffers. It isn't a win in terms of saving the state purse a few shillings. It's a defeat for all of us who rely and need public services, and it's a defeat for workers everywhere. It's deeply ironic that this week we see loads of talk about whether it's time to remove the cap on top bankers whose pay is restrictive at $500,000 a year. The poor old craters have to live on that much. And yet we are being urged to be realistic when it comes to how we treat our public sector workers. We need to retain the best banking talent, we're told. Well, we need to retain the best scientific talent. I've read your speech carefully, and it's interesting that 8 times you mentioned you mentioned momentum, the building momentum deal, and yet you go on to explain carefully that within that there's only a mechanism for increasing pay by 1% within a particular section of that. You also allude to the fact that the MLSA rejected that deal. Well, I'm not surprised. If they've had a claim for 20 years for 8% to bring them up to parity, and there's only a mechanism of 1% within it, it is absolutely no surprise that they rejected building momentum. You cannot repeat that deal over and over again without recognising it will go nowhere to settling this dispute. 98% is a startling figure of workers who voted to take strike action, and they did not do that lightly. And they have, as has been illustrated by Deputy Feehan in the last speech, they have called off their action again and again in order to facilitate talks. This is going nowhere, Minister, unless you and DPAR are at the table and find a solution. The money is in the coffers, you say, you're just restricted by building momentum. Well, then you have to find a way around those restrictions. First of all, just a word about your hopeful message in your speech and in your motion or your amendment for tonight about what's going to happen with the new Coombe testing centre, and how that's going to provide a plan to address workforce resilience and develop and train and all the rest of it. Well, I actually have a PQ answer from the HSE yesterday, which indicates that when this new building opens, for several years we will still be relying on a backup of a second provider. And several years is not spelt out. It doesn't say 2 years or 10 years, that we're still going to be outsourcing cervical check until we bring that up to standard. So don't provide a false hope here that somehow the situation that the MLSA and their members are in is going to change because a new facility opens in the Coombe. That is not the case. I've also see that you mentioned in your speech twice the conflict in Ukraine. Well, 20 years ago there was a worse conflict in Iraq when they first faced this lack of parity. What does that have to do with the price of beans? I don't see why you're bringing it into your speech. You've also in your motion called on the MLSA to call off their strike, and I think that is disgraceful. And I think every deputy who respects themselves and respects these workers should vote against your amendment should we get to vote on it tonight. It's absolutely outrageous. So, Minister, I'll just finish by saying that a victory for these workers will be a victory for all workers, because it will mean that we can build a decent health service in the future by correcting the historic wrongs that have been done to workers that have profound and negative impacts on all the key services that we all rely on.